300 yards to the west, I was shivering uncontrollably in my tent, even though I was zipped into my sleeping bag and wearing my down suit and every other stitch of clothing I had. The gale threatened to blow the tent apart. Every time the door was opened, the shelter would fill with blowing spindrift, so everything inside was covered with an inch-thick layer of snow. Oblivious to the tragedy unfolding outside in the storm, I drifted in and out of consciousness, delirious from exhaustion, dehydration, and the cumulative effects of oxygen depletion. At some point early in the evening, Stuart Hutchison, my tent mate, came in, shook me hard, and asked if I would go outside with him to bang on pots and shine lights into the sky in the hope of guiding the lost climbers in, but I was too weak and incoherent to respond. Hutchison, who had gotten back to camp at 2 p.m. and was thus considerably less debilitated than me, then tried to rouse clients and Sherpas from the other tents. Everybody was too cold or too exhausted, so Hutchison went out into the storm alone. He left our tent 6 times that night to look for the missing climbers, but the blizzard was so fierce that he never dared to venture more than a few yards beyond the margin of camp. The winds were ballistically strong, he emphasizes. The blowing spindrift felt like a sandblaster or something. I could only go out for 15 minutes at a time before I became too cold and had to return to the tent. Out among the climbers hunkered on the eastern edge of the col, Badelman willed himself to stay alert for a sign that the storm might be blowing itself out. Just before midnight, his vigilance was rewarded when he suddenly noticed a few stars overhead and shouted to the others to look. The wind was still whipping up a furious ground blizzard at the surface, but far above, the sky had begun to clear, revealing the hulking silhouettes of Everest and Lhotse. From these reference points, Clef Schoening thought he'd figure out where the group was in relation to Camp 4. After a shouting match with Bidelman, he convinced the guide that he knew the way to the tents. Bidelman tried to coax everyone to their feet and get them moving in the direction indicated by Schoening, but Pittman, Fox, Weathers, and Nambo were too feeble to walk. By then it was obvious to the guide that if somebody from the group didn't make it to the tents and summon a rescue party, they were all going to die. So Bidelman assembled those who were ambulatory, and then he, Schoening, Gamelgard, Groom, and the 2 Sherpas stumbled off into the storm to get help, leaving behind the 4 incapacitated clients with Tim Madsen. Reluctant to abandon his girlfriend, Fox, Madsen selflessly volunteered to stay and look after everybody until help arrived. 20 minutes later, Bidelman's contingent limped into camp, where they had an emotional reunion with a very worried Anatoly Bukreev. Schoening and Bidelman, barely able to speak, told the Russian where to find the 5 clients who'd remained behind out in the elements and then collapsed in their respective tents, utterly spent. Bukreev had come down to the South Col hours in front of anyone else in Fisher's team. Indeed, by 5 p.m., while his teammates were still struggling down to the clouds at 28,000 feet, Bukreev was already in his tent resting and drinking tea. Experienced guides would later question his decision to descend so far ahead of his clients. Extremely unorthodox behavior for a guide. One of the clients from that group has nothing but contempt for Bukreev, insisting that when it mattered most, the guide cut and ran. Anatoly had left the summit around 2 p.m. and quickly became entangled in the traffic jam at the Hillary Step. As soon as the mob dispersed, he moved very rapidly down the southeast ridge without waiting for any clients, despite telling Fisher atop the step that he would be going down with Martin Adams. Bukreev thereby arrived at Camp 4 well before the brunt of the storm. After the expedition, when I asked Anatoly why he had hurried down ahead of his group, he handed me the transcript of an interview he'd given a few days previously to Men's Journal through a Russian interpreter. Bukreev told me that he'd read the transcript and confirmed its accuracy. Reading it on the spot, I quickly came to a series of questions about the descent, to which he had replied. I stayed for about an hour. It is very cold. Naturally, it takes your strength. My position was that I would not be good if I stood around freezing, waiting. I would be more useful if I returned to Camp 4 in order to be able to take oxygen up to the returning climbers or to go up to help them if some became weak during the descent. If you are immobile at that altitude, you lose strength in the cold, and then you are unable to do anything. Bukreev's susceptibility to the cold was doubtless greatly exacerbated by the fact that he wasn't using supplemental oxygen. In the absence of gas, he simply couldn't stop to wait for slow climbs on the summit ridge without courting frostbite and hypothermia. For whatever reason, he raced down ahead of the group, which in fact had been his pattern throughout the entire expedition. As Fisher's final letters and phone calls from base camp to Seattle made clear, when I questioned him about the wisdom of leaving his clients on the summit ridge, Anatoly insisted that it was for the good of the team. It is much better for me to warm myself at South Call, be ready to carry up oxygen if clients run out. Indeed, shortly after dark, after Bidelman's group failed to return, and the storm had risen to hurricane intensity, Bucriv realized they must be in trouble and made a courageous attempt to bring oxygen to them. But his stratagem had a serious flaw. Because neither he nor Bidelman had a radio, Anatoly had no way of knowing the true nature of the missing climbers' predicament, or even where on the huge expanse of the upper mountain they might be. Around 7:30 p.m., Bucriv left Camp 4 to search for the group regardless. By then, he recalled, visibility was maybe a meter, it disappeared altogether. I had a lamp, and I began to use oxygen to speed up my ascent. I was carrying 3 bottles. I tried go faster, but visibility was gone. It is like being without eyes, without being able to see. It was impossible to see. That is very dangerous, because one can fall into a crevasse. One can fall toward the southern side of Lhotse, 3,000 meters straight down. I tried to go up. It was dark. I could not find the fixed line. Some 600 feet above the call, Bucriv recognized the futility of his effort and returned to the tents, but he admits he very nearly became lost himself. In any case, it was just as well that he abandoned this rescue effort, because at that point his teammates were no longer on the peak above, where Bucriv had been headed. By the time he gave up his search, Bidelman's group was actually wandering around on the call 600 feet below the Russian. Bucriv arrived back at Camp 4 around 9 p.m. exhausted and extremely concerned about his missing teammates. He sat down on his pack at the edge of camp, cradled his head in his hands, and tried to figure out how he might rescue them. The wind is driving snow into my back, but I am powerless to move, he later recalled. How long I was there, I don't remember. It is here that I start to lose track of time, because I am so tired, so exhausted.